whenever you go to Walmart or you go into a store today, sometimes what you want to buy isn't there. And prices are going up like crazy. Part of that's inflation, but a lot of it's what's going on with the supply chain. The supply chains have gone global many years ago. For the past couple of decades, you've noticed most companies have moved jobs to low-wage manufacturing locations, such as China. The majority of the things we buy nowadays are made there. And that's made economic sense because they can charge consumers less, so we benefit, and they can make more money on it. The only people who really don't benefit from it are local employees, because a lot of the manufacturing jobs went away. But it made economic sense for suppliers to do this. Well, the problem is, it turned out global supply chains are very, very fragile. As we saw when the COVID epidemic hit and the pandemic hit, and there I think people did panic in the reactions to it. In hindsight, the countries that didn't close down at all are doing far better than everybody else who did close down and did pretty draconian response to it. But people were scared, people didn't know what was going on, so they reacted that way. So what's going on now is supply chains, it'll take years for everything to get straightened back out and become more efficient the way they used to be. So how do we handle that? What's going on with that right now? Because we're dealing with all of those problems with the supply chains just from the COVID. And then when we think things are, we might have a plan for getting forward, it's gonna take a couple more years, but we have a plan for going forward. Then Russia invaded the Ukraine. Something else people didn't plan for, of course. But what has that done to our supply chains? You might think, what difference could those two countries have on us here in the United States? Well, the Ukraine is one of the chief providers for something called neon. It's a gas, but it comes in various quality levels. And neon is used, we import like 90% of our neon from the Ukraine, and that's a key component for semiconductors. Oh, thank you.
I think you're working. I can add something to my resume.
Look, I'll come back to the neon, but just generally, this is a slide I got from a medical consultant, and this shows what they were dealing with in January in the medical industry alone. Shipping costs, container shipments from Asia are up 250% from the previous year. Trucking costs within the United States in January were up 22%. Raw materials such as aluminum were up 56%. And then if you're a manufacturer making medical goods, who is the target for the slides, then there are local domestic shipping in the United States for freight out. Small trucks was up about 6%. So we wonder why all our prices are going up like crazy and everything we're paying for. Well, all of their expenses have gone up. And they can only eat so many costs before they either go bankrupt or have to dramatically raise their prices. Get caught up to where I was talking then. Okay, Russia and the Ukraine together were about 30% of the global wheat export market. So in addition to feeding their own countries, they fed a large portion of the world with their wheat, about another 27% for corn exports. We're not going to notice any of that in the United States. We don't need to import either of those, but the prices are going to go up because our farmers, people from around the world, are now trying to buy from the United States who used to buy from these other countries. Russia was a top exporter of fertilizers that's going to impact food production around the world. For example, Brazil imported 30% of its fertilizer from Russia. Now they can't buy enough fertilizer from anybody, so their crops for this year are going to be far less than they are usually. So that means next year's food crop is going to be lower than this year's food crop in Brazil, and that's going to be duplicated in many countries around the world. So when you see what food prices are today, well, I hate to tell you this, but they're going to be worse next year. Okay, additional impact. Here's where the neon I was talking about. Our semiconductor firms get 90% of the neon, which is one of the elements they need for their semiconductors from Ukraine. Semiconductors have already been having problems. One of the reasons, even before COVID, there was problems buying cars was some of the computer chips that went in them. If you remember back to 2011, when there was a big earthquake that caused then a tidal wave that they called the nuclear meltdown in Japan, almost a trifecta of problems for them. Well, it irradiated parts of Japan, and they closed down a bunch of semiconductor factories. And it takes many years to build a new fabrication plant, and we were just about caught up to that when COVID hit. So the semiconductors are especially still going to be messed up for several more years to come. Russia provided 35% of the palladium used in the United States. That's another precious element. And that's needed for things like catalytic converters, fuel cells, electronics, blood sugar test strips, all sorts of things. You may never have heard of that metal other than high school chemistry, but it's a vital element in today's society, and now we need to find other places to get it because we're not buying from Russia because of the war right now. So huge, huge impact on all our supply chains. In fact, you might have read one of the fastest growing areas of theft in the United States is catalytic converters. People are stealing them from your cars because the palladium's worth so much money now. Okay. Now fuel. I try to be very apolitical, and whichever side of the spectrum you're on, doesn't matter, I'm just going to tell you results. But our current administration campaigned on the promise to move us away from the oil economy and to move us into a more green way, away from petroleum. And that's going to be great for us in the long term, but in the short term, that dramatically increased the price of gas, some of the initiatives that they did. And then with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, more oil-producing nations, that really had an impact on it. So that's why we see larger gas prices, especially when it comes to diesel. And unfortunately, that news gets worse too. Refineries, which is what takes oil and turns it into gas and diesel, are very expensive to operate, and they need periodic capital inflows in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Now, they're very profitable, especially as gas prices go up. They make a couple extra cents a gallon, and they sell tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of gallons. So they're very profitable. But if you're an investor, do you want to put tens or hundreds of millions of dollars into refineries when it's time if you know the political administration wants to move away from it? So what happened is there were several refineries that temporarily closed during the COVID epidemic because people were doing a lot less driving then, so that's one of the reasons gas prices were really cheap in 2020. But what's happened is now they've decided we're not going to invest the money on it. The future is not in oil. The current administration wants us to do other things, so why would we put $100 million in fixing up a refinery? So several of these that temporarily closed have announced we're permanently closing. Now a couple others have announced that they're going to close in a few more years as well and just not do it. Because you can see here is how much we can refine per year, distillation capacity. This is millions of barrels per calendar day. It was 19 million barrels in 2020. And we had a little flexibility up there because we weren't using it because people were driving less that year. Well, in 2021, we could do 18.1 and a little bit were idle, but these idle ones, those are the ones that aren't being restarted. So we actually lost capacity this last year, and we're going to lose capacity for the next few years because the incentives aren't there to build new ones. In fact, the incentives are, when it needs new maintenance, just shut them down. So to summarize what I've covered on the global supply chain, turns out they're at great risk of disruption when things like pandemics come up or wars come up, and it'll take years to return to normal efficiency.